Cradle Rock crouched beneath the heat like a dying dog, its wooden bones creaking in the wind, its streets crusted in dust the color of dried blood. The sun hung over the jagged hills like an executioner's lantern, casting long shadows across the cracked boards of saloons and the rusted signs of pawn shops that hadn't changed hands in decades. Out here, time didn't pass, it baked. Most folks passed through Cradle Rock without wanting to look back. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed second chances. The hills were mined out, the wells ran shallow, and the wind carried the stink of old violence. Whatever law remained came from a sheriff who kept his boots polished and his conscience dusty. The blacksmith shop stood near the edge of town, just beyond where the road veered toward the canyon pass. Its windows were always open, letting the hammer's rhythm echo like a heartbeat through the air. The man behind that hammer, Ezra Cole, moved like a machine carved from the same iron he bent. He didn't smile, didn't drink, didn't talk unless he had to, and even then, it was with a voice like gravel over rust. Some said he used to be something else, something dangerous, but people didn't ask. They brought their busted wheels, their broken hinges, and their rusted rifle triggers. He fixed them. That was all. Most days, it was the girl who opened shop at dawn, swept the dust from the porch, and ladled water from the barrel out front. Sarah, slim, quiet, never without a ribbon in her braid. She had a look in her eyes like someone who'd been born too close to fire and never quite stepped away from it. Folks figured she worked for Ezra, helped with the books, fetched the steel, maybe cleaned the place after hours. No one thought to ask more. In Cradle Rock, questions were invitations to grief. But the truth was, Sarah Cole wasn't just a helper. She was the quiet storm behind Ezra's calm. They'd married 3 winters ago in a canyon chapel buried in snow, with no preacher but a wandering drunk and no witness but the stars. It was their secret, and they kept it close, not out of shame, but protection. Because in Cradle Rock, a man with something to lose was a man with a target on his chest. She moved through the town like smoke, present but untouchable. Until the day Bo Lynch came back. Bo had once worn the gray of the South, but now he dressed in snake hide and silver, with a scar down his jaw and a grin that never reached his eyes. He and his men rode into town just as the wind was shifting, dust curling around their horses' hooves like coils of a rattler. They had the confidence of men who'd never been punished. Cradle Rock stopped breathing when they arrived. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Shopkeepers fumbled to close early. Even the sheriff tipped his hat and pretended to count the clouds. Bo had that effect. He'd been gone a while, bleeding dry the smaller settlements west of the hills. Now he was back, his eyes on new soil. They took the corner table in the saloon, demanded whiskey, and spoke loud, laughed louder. They spoke of land deeds and bodies, of women taken and men broken, as if they were discussing the weather. Nobody interrupted. Bo Lynch didn't deal in warnings. He didn't need to. It was late afternoon when Sarah walked into the saloon. She'd come to fetch the account book from the storekeep, but the moment her boots crossed the threshold, the room thickened. Her eyes never rose beyond the bar, but Bo saw her. His laughter cut short. He leaned forward, like a hound catching a scent. "Well now," he muttered, licking his teeth. "Who's she belong to?" No one answered. The bartender kept wiping clean glasses, with shaking hands. Bo stood and took a slow step forward. The men behind him murmured. Sarah paused, then turned face calm, mouth a tight line. He let out a low whistle. Ain't seen one stand that straight in a long time. One of his men laughed. "You gonna buy her, or just watch her walk out?" Bo didn't smile. He leaned in just close enough for Sarah to smell the tobacco on his breath. "What's your name, sugar?" She didn't answer. That seemed to amuse him even more. "I like him proud," he said, turning to his men. "Makes the breaking all the sweeter." She walked past him. Didn't run. Didn't glance back. Bo watched her go. His eyes narrowed, tongue pressed against the inside of his cheek. When she disappeared around the corner, he said it. "That one ain't been broken yet." Ezra didn't hear the words. Not then, but he felt them later, in the silence Sarah carried home. She said nothing that night, just placed the account book on the table and sat by the window long after the candles burned low. Ezra watched her, his jaw grinding like millstone, sparks dying slow behind his eyes. Next morning, the town was still. Too still. No hammer rang. No forge hissed. But the wind carried tension, sharp and metal-laced. Bo Lynch wasn't done watching. And the town, like always, wasn't about to stop him. What nobody knew was that Ezra had already begun listening. To the weight of old memories, to the sound of his wife's breath, to the whisper of a name he hadn't heard in a decade. The name they used to call him when he wasn't just a blacksmith. He hadn't needed it in years. But the hills were shifting again, and Cradle Rock was about to remember what fear really tasted like. The sun was a white coin nailed into the sky, bleeding heat across the desert floor. The forge lay quiet that morning, its doors open but the anvil cold. Ezra had left before dawn with a borrowed mule cart, heading toward Bitter Ridge to collect raw iron. He hadn't said when he'd be back. He never did. But Sarah knew the hours by the light and the wind. She knew she had 3 before the heat reached its worst. She was sorting horseshoes when she heard the hooves. 3 horses, maybe 4, coming slow, deliberate. Not the pace of messengers. The scrape of iron against packed earth stopped just beyond the hitching post. She looked up, squinting into the glare. Bo Lynch sat tall in the saddle, flanked by 2 of his men. Dust clung to their coats like old sins. Their eyes didn't wander. They were here for something. Sarah stood, straightened her skirt, and wiped her hands on the apron. The hammer on the workbench was inches from her fingers, but she didn't reach. Bo dismounted with a practiced ease, as if this town already belonged to him. He walked past the horseshoe barrels, past the open door, until he was standing just feet away. "Where's the smith?" he asked, voice smooth like oiled leather. "Gone," Sarah said. "Pity." His boots crunched over scattered nails. "I figure he'd want to see this." She didn't respond. Her jaw was tight. Bo turned his head slightly, eyes tracing the forge, then landing back on her. "You know, I've been thinking about you." The men behind him chuckled. Sarah remained still. Bo's expression flattened. "That little thing you pulled in the saloon, walking past me like I was smoke, made me curious." She met his gaze then. Steady. Clear. And that rattled him. He reached forward and grabbed her arm. The hammer on the table didn't move. Neither did she. He shoved her backward. She stumbled, catching herself against the wooden post, where horses were usually tied. "Get the rope," he said. One of his men pulled a coil from his saddle. Sarah's wrists were yanked behind the post and bound tight. Her breath hitched once, no more. Her eyes never left Bo. He stepped forward, took a long look at her face, and slapped her. A wet sound cracked the silence. Her head snapped to the side, and blood spilled from her lip. No scream, not a whisper, just silence, and those eyes unwavering. He hit her again, and again. The wind held its breath. Across the street, behind shuttered windows, the town watched. One man in a store doorway turned away, hands shaking against the frame. Sarah didn't cry. Bo was sweating now. Not from heat, but something else. That stare. That defiance. It lit something dark in him. "You're gonna break," he said, panting. "They all do." She bled quietly. Spit foamed at the corner of his mouth. He raised his hand again. "Bo," one of the men said. "Maybe we." Bo ignored him and delivered another blow, harder, snapping her head back. Then he stepped away, breathing hard. "Tell your boss I'll be back for you proper," he muttered, shaking blood from his knuckles. "We'll talk slow next time." He turned, mounted his horse, and clicked his tongue to the others. That's when it came. Clang. A single, sharp note, cutting through the heat. Metal on stone. Deliberate. Final. The riders froze. From the shadows of the forge, a figure emerged. Tall. Broad. Coat dusted in iron shavings. Face dark with soot and stillness. Ezra Cole. He stood in the doorway like a storm gathering behind mountains, his silhouette long and motionless. In his hand, the hammer hung heavy. His eyes, cool and unreadable, drifted over Bo, then Sarah, then back again. He said nothing. Bo blinked, squinting. "Smith." Ezra took a step forward. His boots echoed against the packed dirt. Another step. He stopped just beside Sarah. Her face was bloodied, one eye swelling shut, lips torn. Still, she didn't look away. Ezra didn't speak to her, didn't touch Bo. He just looked at him and said, with a voice low and thunder-thick, "You touched my wife." Bo's brow twitched. Confusion flickered, then amusement. "You're what?" Ezra's gaze didn't shift. Bo scoffed. "Well, hell," he muttered, laughing. Didn't know the mute had a woman. One of his men let out a snort. The other didn't laugh. He stared at Ezra's grip on that hammer, eyes narrowing. Ezra didn't answer. He turned to Sarah, untied her ropes with quiet precision. Her hands were trembling now, the pain setting in. But she stood straight. Ezra didn't cradle her, didn't make a scene. He placed one calloused hand on the small of her back, light, steady, a promise made without words. Then he walked into the forge. Door creaked, then closed. Bo sat in the saddle for a long moment, staring at the closed door. He spat once, looked down at his bloodied hand, and tried to laugh again. But something in the air had shifted, and the wind, restless and dry, began to blow east. They said it in whispers the next morning, over tin cups and behind swinging shutters. "Wife." The word slid through Cradle Rock, like smoke through a broken chimney. It reached the saloon before noon, curled around the barber's chair, lingered in the church's empty pews. A few chuckled, shaking their heads. Others narrowed their eyes, recalling the look on Ezra's face. No one said it to him directly. No one ever said much to Ezra Cole. The sheriff sat outside his office that day, boots up on the rail, had tilted low enough to pretend he couldn't see the bruises still drying on Sarah's cheek as she passed with a bucket. He didn't tip his hat, didn't offer comfort, didn't even flinch. He knew Bo Lynch too well. He knew which battles weren't his to fight. But that night, the saloon cracked open with the sound of a voice that had too many stories to keep quiet. "Crowhammer," muttered old Bram, pouring his own drink since the barkeep had long since gone to bed. "Ain't no damn blacksmith." A ranch hand leaned in. "Who?" Bram sipped and licked the whiskey off his mustache. "Ezra, the quiet one. You boys weren't out west 10 years back, were you?" He didn't wait for an answer. There was a time when bad men, real bad men, used to look over their shoulders if they heard a hammer drop. Not because it meant someone was working, but because it meant Ezra Cole had come looking for him. The others leaned closer. They called him the Crowhammer. Bram went on, voice slow like river molasses. Said he could hear death coming. He once tracked the Rollins gang across the Sierra in the dead of winter. 13 men. Left 12 of them in a ditch. The 13th ran blind into a gorge. They say he hit the rocks so hard, the bird stopped flying for a mile. One man snorted, unconvinced. Bram shrugged. "Don't believe me. But I saw it. He wore a long black coat, had pistols so worn down they looked like bone. Never shouted. Just knocked once, real polite. Then folks started dying." "So what happened?" the ranch hand asked. Bram poured another drink. "No one knows. One day he just stopped, took off the coat, threw his marshal's badge in the dirt, and walked away. Next time anyone saw him, he was pounding out horseshoes in a town nobody wanted. Guess he figured peace was worth the wait." The ranch hand glanced out the window, toward the faint red glow from the blacksmith's forge across the street. "Well," he muttered, "peace didn't last." That night, rain fell for the first time in weeks. Not a storm, just a steady, cleansing drizzle. The kind that made the streets hiss, where hot dust met cold drops. Inside the forge, the air was thick with the smell of blood and steel. Sarah moved quietly, as always. Her eye was swelling shut now, cheek cracked open like a broken apple. She didn't wince as she dabbed the salve across her wounds. The pain had already sunk beneath the skin. What remained was colder, sharper. From beneath a loose floorboard, she pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle. It thudded onto the forge like an unspoken truth. Ezra turned from the back table, eyes flicking to the shape as she unwrapped it. 2 pistols. Old, scarred, burnished silver kissed by rust. His name carved faintly on the grips, worn down by years of silent service. "You said you'd never use them again," she said. Her voice wasn't soft. It wasn't bitter. It just was Ezra looked at her. Then the guns. Then the forge. I won't. She didn't move. He crossed the room, placed one hand on the pistol's grip, then slid it away. In its place, he reached above the mantel and pulled down something that had hung untouched for years. The hammer. Not a tool. Not anymore. This one wasn't for bending steel into bits of use. It was heavier, darker, its edges jagged like the spine of a beast. It had weight that wasn't measured in pounds. It had history. Ezra ran a hand over its face. A long breath passed between his lips. But I'll make him feel the weight, he said, turning back to her, of every nail they ever drove into someone weaker. She watched him as he turned toward the forge. Coal flared. Sparks lifted into the rafters like tiny spirits begging for freedom. The hammer met the anvil with a thunder that shook dust from the beams. He didn't speak again, just worked, sharpening, sanding, heating, cooling. Outside, the town listened. Children peeked from upstairs windows. The sheriff closed his door. Bo Lynch, 2 buildings away, stood behind his curtain, jaw tight, bottle untouched. He didn't say a word. In Cradle Rock, something ancient stirred awake, the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. The sun climbed toward its cruelest hour, casting Cradle Rock in a white glare that turned everything to bone and shadow. High noon. Silence clung to the buildings like smoke from an old fire. Doors bolted, curtains drawn. Even the dogs were gone, vanished into cellars or behind nailed barn doors. The sound came slow, hoofbeats, steady and deliberate, pounding like a war drum on the hard-packed street. 11 riders. Dust curled around their boots and reins, horses snorting with anticipation. Bo Lynch rode at the front, wide-shouldered and sneering, a shotgun across his lap, and a lit cigar clenched between yellowed teeth. "Look at this," he said, spitting onto the cracked road. "Town looks like it forgot how to breathe." One of his men, younger than the rest, leaned in and chuckled. "Yes, she ran." Bo laughed. "Or maybe the blacksmith figured we'd let it go." The gang spread out slowly, horses shifting beneath them. Their eyes scanned the windows, looking for cowards, witnesses, or both. But nothing moved. Cradle Rock had turned into a ghost town. Except for the forge. The doors were wide open. Inside, a single figure stood still as stone. Ezra Cole, dressed in a long leather apron, arms bare, his face a mask of ash and sweat. In his hand, he held the hammer. Not the kind meant to mend wagon wheels or horseshoes, but the other one. The one forged from silence, from rage, from memory. He didn't speak. He just watched them come. Bo tugged his horse to a stop just 20 feet away. He leaned forward in the saddle. "You got a death wish, Smith." Ezra didn't move. Bo gave a crooked smile. "Fine." He raised his hand. "End him." The first man dismounted. Ezra didn't flinch. The thug raised a revolver, too slow. Crack. Ezra's hammer collided with the man's wrist before the trigger could be pulled. Bones shattered like dry timber. The scream hadn't left his mouth before Ezra's elbow crushed his jaw, sending teeth spinning into the dirt. Then chaos. 3 men rushed him at once. One went low, another from behind, the third with a rifle already cocked. Ezra moved like a storm, slow and unstoppable. The hammer arced in a wide, humming circle, catching one in the ribs, with a crunch that folded him inward like wet paper. A boot swept the legs of another. The rifleman aimed. Clang. A horseshoe, thrown like a blade, struck his hand. Gun fired wild into the sky as Ezra tackled him, slamming him against the forge wall. Smoke poured from the furnace. Iron hissed in its bed. One thug staggered too close. Ezra grabbed him by the collar and flung him inside. Screams erupted, echoing off the steel and stone, and then went silent. Bo stared, lips parted. He'd seen gunfights. He'd seen ambushes, lynchings, arson. But this was something older. Something worse. 2 of his men turned to flee. Asterisk bang. Bang asterisk. They dropped in the street, necks snapping sideways, blood misting in the air. Bo's head whipped upward. On the rooftop of the livery stood Sarah, one eye still swollen shut, the other burning with cold fire. In her hands, a rifle steadied on a nail. She reloaded. Cocked. One shot. Another man down. Bo's crew screamed, tried to scatter, but they had nowhere to go. Ezra was already among them, breathing like a bull, his hammer dripping with sweat and blood. The youngest of the gang dropped his weapon and begged. Ezra struck him in the knee, then again across the face. Not to kill, just to stop. A final man raised a shotgun. Crack! Sarah's bullet split his shoulder open. He screamed once, then was silent. Soon only Bo remained. Still mounted, hands shaking. He stared at the bodies, his men broken, bleeding, unmoving in the dust. "You," he stammered. "You call this justice?" Ezra stepped forward, slow and steady, his boots crunching bone and brass underfoot. "No," he said, voice low. "This is the bill come due." Bo screamed and drew. The hammer flew. It spun end over end, a black arc against the burning sun, until it struck Bo dead center in the chest. The sound was like thunder hitting stone. Bo flew backward off the horse, hit the ground, and didn't rise. Silence reclaimed the town. Dust swirled in slow, wide circles around the bodies. The wind shifted, and somewhere, faint and distant, a church bell rang, for the first time in years. The dust had barely settled when Sarah stepped down from the rooftop. Her boots hit the ground with the weight of something final. She didn't rush. She didn't falter. The wind tugged at her braid as she passed the bodies in the street, some still groaning, some already gone, and walked straight to the forge, where Ezra stood among blood, splintered tools, and silence. Behind her, Cradle Rock began to breathe again. Doors creaked open. Faces peeked out. An old man crossed himself. Children were hushed by trembling mothers. Then, for the first time in years, the preacher's bell rang. Once. Twice. A slow, mournful toll. It carried through the canyons and across the hills like a eulogy for something that had finally ended. The sheriff, pale and sweating, walked down from his office, hat in hand. He stared at the bodies, then at Sarah, then at Ezra. He didn't speak, just laid his badge on the saloon step and walked away into the horizon. No one stopped him. Ezra didn't speak either. He stood in the doorway of the forge, blood on his hands, dirt on his brow, and the hammer still lodged in Bo Lynch's chest across the street. His eyes met Sarah's as she approached. Neither smiled. They didn't need to. She reached up, touched his cheek, just once, and then went inside. The next morning, Ezra rose before the sun and began to clean. Not just the mess from the fight, but everything. The anvil, the floorboards, the walls that had caught bits of chaos. He scrubbed slowly, methodically, dipping his rag into buckets gone pink with blood and soot. He didn't do it out of guilt. There was no shame in what had been done, but he did it with reverence, like one might tend a grave. By afternoon, he had pulled the hammer from Bo's chest and set to reforging it. Not for use. Not again. He heated it until it glowed white, bent it with quiet fury, and shaped it into a cross, jagged, misshapen, but honest. He polished it clean and etched 4 words into its face with the fine chisel Sarah once used to mark saddle buckles. For the silenced, the bruised, the bound. He mounted it above the forge's entrance, right where the wind could see it. When people came the next day, timid, respectful, they didn't ask questions. They brought tools again. Broken gates, a rusted plow, a pair of worn stirrups, and they brought coins, which Sarah counted carefully with ink-stained fingers and neat handwriting. It was her now. The books, the orders, the voice at the counter, where before folks had nodded politely at her. Now they greeted her properly. Mrs. Cole, they said, and meant it. Ezra still spoke little, still didn't drink or linger in crowds. But when he walked through town now, people made way with something more than fear. It was recognition, a sort of solemn respect. And so, Cradle Rock bent itself back toward order. Not quickly, not perfectly, but the rot had been carved out, and in its place came the slow breath of healing. Weeks passed. The heat eased. The forge's fire burned steady. One morning, a rider came from the south. He was lean, cloaked, with a pistol on one hip and a silver badge on the other. His horse was tired, but the man rode like he'd been looking for something for a long time. He stopped in front of the forge, dismounted, and nodded toward Ezra, who was hammering out a wagon hitch. "You Ezra Cole?" the man asked. Ezra didn't look up. "Depends." The rider stepped closer. "I'm looking for a man they used to call the Crow Hammer. Been following stories from the Sierra to the Salt Plains. Heard he came through Cradle Rock." Ezra paused mid-strike. The metal glowed. The room was quiet but for the low hiss of the coals. He looked up, eyes calm. "Ain't no bounty hunter here." The rider tilted his head. "That's so." Ezra wiped his brow with the back of his hand, nodded toward the bell tower. "Just a man who knows what a wife's worth." The rider studied him a long moment, then nodded once, respectful, and turned back toward his horse. As the hooves faded down the road, Ezra returned to his work. The fire flared, the iron hissed, and above the forge, the wind whispered through the memorial cross, its edges catching sunlight like the glint of a silent promise kept. The forge still burned steady in Cradle Rock, even 10 years on. Its heat rolled out into the street like breath from the belly of the earth, and the steady clang of iron on steel could still be heard at sunup and sundown alike. Folks said it was the heartbeat of the town, and if that was true, then the soul of it lived just down the road, in a quiet saloon with a crooked sign and a man behind the counter who remembered everything. The boy came in just past dusk, shoulders square, soot on his face, and a glint of fire behind his eyes. His apron was too big, his hands too soft, but the calluses were coming in. He ordered a sarsaparilla, polite, and sat near the window where the breeze could reach. Old Bram leaned over the bar, drying a glass for the 3rd time, eyeing the kid like he was looking at a ghost with a heartbeat. "You're the apprentice," he said, voice like gravel warmed in bourbon. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir. Ezra Cole took me on 2 springs ago. I help with the mule shoes. Rivets, bracers, whatever needs doing." Bram raised a shaggy brow. "That right?" The boy looked around the dim saloon. "He don't say much, but he watches. Makes a man straighten up just by standing near." Bram smiled, a crooked thing that never quite reached his eyes anymore. "That's him, all right." He motioned to the wall behind the bar, where an old, sun-faded sketch hung in a dusty frame. Pencil lines worn, edges curled. It showed a towering figure holding a hammer, smoke rising behind him. The name etched below it in faded ink read, "Ezra Cole, Blacksmith." The boy followed the look, his brows lifting. "That him?" "Him," Bram said, "though some say it ain't just a blacksmith in that picture." The boy turned, curious now. "What do you mean?" Bram leaned closer, voice low like the opening line of a sacred story. "They say Ezra Cole used to be a ghost with a badge. Brought justice on horseback, never smiled, never missed. They called him the Crow Hammer, 'cause by the time he left a place, there weren't nothing left but carrion birds and silence." The boy blinked. "That true?" Bram shrugged. "Depends who you ask. Some say he melted his own guns into plowshares. Others say he buried 'em under the canyon, where no man dares dig. Me, I say the man you work for today once stood alone against 11 killers and left 'em scattered in the dust like broken nails." The saloon quieted for a beat. Even the wind held still. "And that woman, Sarah?" Bram went on, tapping the bar softly. "She made this town honest again. She's the reason kids can run through the square without fear, why the bell rings every Sunday, and why no man ever raises his hand where she can see." The boy looked down, thoughtful. "He ever talk about it?" "No," Bram said. "Not a word. But he keeps a cross above the forge, made from the same hammer he used that day. You seen it?" The boy nodded. "Yeah. Reads something about the silenced." "For the silenced, the bruised, the bound," Bram recited, gaze distant. "It ain't just metal. It's a memory." Outside, the forge bell rang once, deep and sure. The boy rose to go. Bram called after him, voice soft. He never spoke more than a few words, but when he did, people listened. The boy paused in the doorway, caught in the golden light of the setting sun. He looked back once, eyes still young but changed. "You reckon justice was served that day?" Bram exhaled, watching dust drift in the beam of light, like floating ash. "They say justice is blind," he said. "But out here in the West, sometimes it carries a hammer.